And welcome today to another episode of Winning with Insights. My name is Mike. I'll be your host for today. And I have an esteemed guest today in Tjitte. He's the co-founder of RevFixr, a pricing and packaging expert. So Tjitte, before we get started today, can you quickly introduce yourself and also elaborate a little bit more on your professional background?
Thank you for inviting me, Mike. I'm happy to be on the podcast. Happy to introduce myself. I'm Tjitte. Feel free to call me TJ throughout the podcast if that's easier. I started in SaaS almost a decade ago now. First job was in the US at the Harvard Innovation Lab in Boston, where I was helping a software company that had built a marketplace for emerging technology experts and help them connect those with large enterprises. And while I was there, they were also building out the LMS. And I still remember halfway through my internship, they finished the B2B proposition. And I just asked them, okay, how are you guys going to monetize that, right? How are you going to sell it? How are you going to make money off it? And said, well, we don't know yet. So it's okay, let me give it a go. See if I can acquire customers for you guys, right? Set up a few meetings. And that's basically how my career started. It took off quite quickly. It opened my eyes to, hey, what's possible if you just nail the messaging. And I stayed on the trajectory for the last 10 years nearly. So worked at several software companies where I was helping with the initial customers in either a new market or a new product. But always those first couple customers. From marketing, sales, I've done customer success, a little bit of product as well. And always being the voice of the customers internally to really figure out, okay, constant validation, right? We're trying to solve a problem. Is this the right problem? What do we need to tweak? So I've done that both in the US, I've done that here in the Netherlands. I've also worked 2 years at Aim for the Moon, which is a corporate innovation studio, or used to be a corporate innovation studio to very recently, unfortunately, in the Netherlands, where we built corporate ventures with enterprise in the Netherlands. Think of Walter Kluwer, Renewy, other companies, right, that were looking to, okay, how can we build new business models to ensure our continuity throughout our lifetimes? So that's a bit about my background.
So you're always very actively involved in like the beginning of
Yes.
new ideas, in the beginning of new business models and services. Um, so you've recently then started with RevFixr, where you're focused mainly on the pricing and packaging part. What triggered you to actually get started with this?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think there's two stories coming together, but if you look at like my own background, I've personally been constantly in that role of figuring out, okay, well, first, can we even solve a problem, right? And can we charge for that? But the next following question, right? If someone is willing to pay, okay, how much should we now charge them? And throughout the last 10 years, I've had the unique experience where I was constantly moving from startup to startup, where when I came in, there was no pricing structure, at least no fixed ones. Some people had an idea, right? But we were quite flexible, especially, right? You think you have a model in those early stages, but then the enterprise customer comes in, you're like, oh, maybe we should really customize for this client, right? So I had this unique exposure where I could experiment a lot. But at the same time, when I'm saying that, right, that also means that even though we had a pricing model, we still deviate from the pricing model. So it was clear to me, on the one hand, I got the experience, but at the same time, I got that experience because companies in those early stages did not stick to their pricing. And every time a big one came along, they got anxiety. Does our model actually work? And maybe to put it in one sentence, founders are always afraid of leaving money on the table. And not just founder, the whole sales team, and then maybe even the product team, right? The whole company is afraid we leave money on the table. It's always funny. When you close that deal, you're afraid you left money on the table. When you lost the deal, you're afraid you might have charged a bit too much, right? So that's it on the one hand, that's my experience. But getting to this point, about a year ago, I joined Velings. So Velings is started by Anwar El Haji, which is my co-founder, and Renier. Um, but I joined these guys to figure out, I joined them as a venture builder and figure out if you could actually build a new business model with the platform they had. And we got to a stage where our customers were quite interested in what we had to offer. But in order to implement that pricing model, the solution, they kept on saying, we need to figure out what our pricing model actually looks like, right? And then mature it a little bit more before we can actually implement your solution. And you hit it once, and you say, okay, maybe this is not going to be our client. You hit it twice, and you start doubting, wait, this is always going to be a problem. And the third one, right, in the middle of the call, someone said, can you guys actually help with that as well? And I mean, you only need to hear it 3 times, right? Or maybe even twice before you say, let's do it. So we said, yeah, we help with that as well. And the ball just started rolling from there. So what we thought initially was going to be essentially paid sales, right? We thought, okay, if we just let them pay for this bit of consultancy and we can implement our solution, then we can go from there. But it became where we basically dropped the entire solution, and RevFixr became its own company where we started doing monetization, consultancy, essentially.
Fair enough. So it all started out a little bit differently, but there was like this aha moment after you had a couple of
Yeah,
conversations where you saw the opportunity in helping other businesses, like structuring or at least being able to make sense of their pricing and packaging so that it's relevant for their buyers.
exactly.
So if you dive a little bit deeper into that and basically get like a good understanding of where you are right now, when did you, or like, how were the conversations that you've had with these founders of these businesses? How were they like? Like, what kind of questions did you ask them, and what kind of insights did you uncover to make sure that you actually were nailing down the problem that you're solving?
It's a good question. I think it's two-sided. One is, of course, well, I'm biased, but I think in this sense, in a good way, is I've been in that seat, right, where you come up with pricing. So I'm basically already my own customer. That's gonna help me a lot. And I did it at various companies. Sure, I'm still that one person with his own thoughts, right, and his own way of doing things. But at least I already had the exposure of doing exactly this at multiple companies. But then I think one of the questions we always ask, I always love this one is, how did you get to this pricing, right? How did you come to this point? And one of the most commonly cited ways of experimenting with pricing, and at least I see in SaaS with founders, is they come to some price, they look at the competitors first, right? But then what happens is they feel like they left money on the table. So the next deal, they just double the price and see what actually happens. And more often than not, in those early stages, that's going to work because very few people I know come flying in and actually ask way too much. The majority of the people ask too little, and they tell themselves, and I've done this too, right? Like you go to a new market and you're there to learn. So you rather get as many customers as you can just to get the learnings for the product, which can be good. It can also be bad. But what ends up happening is you just ask way too little. So they double their price to see what happens. If that was successful, they'll do it again. And they might do it again until it doesn't work anymore, right? And then that's where they quit, right? And then basically nothing happens except for indexing. And maybe at some point they add add-ons or they change the price, but the fundamental price model, right? Whether you do seat-based usage, etc., for the majority of the companies I speak with, they say, okay, we did it at the initial stage. We thought of it once and we never really revisited. Because another question I might get is, okay, why do you ask this price point? And they say, because someone paid it, right? Someone was willing to pay it. That's why I ask it.
Yeah. I know from experience that that's often how
Yeah.
it goes. And when you're diving a little bit deeper into like the current pricing structure, you already mentioned like seat-based or usage-based. I've also heard about different pricing structures, where it's like a cost-based pricing or value-based.
Yeah.
There are probably many more that you know of that I'm unaware of. What are some of the most common pricing structures that are used when people are just getting started with their business?
I think we need to split those apart, what you just said. So you have on the one hand like the cost plus model, right? That used to be very popular, of course, especially if you start building hardware. That still makes sense, right? You figure out, okay, how much does it actually cost, and we add a percentage on top of that. But for SaaS, that just doesn't make sense, because once you build it, right, getting that in like second license is just copy and pasting. The marginal cost is limited. So that just doesn't work anymore. The second thing they might do is they look at competitors, which is a fine start, right? If you have competitors, it is an okay start, and you figure, okay, where are we versus the competitors? But at least what I've personally experienced is that sometimes you can ask a premium price for offering fewer services or fewer functionality, right? Because if you actually know the problem you're solving for your customer, right, the job they have, the job to be done, they are willing to pay a premium price just for getting that fixed. And sometimes, well, most of the times, SaaS companies over time keep on adding functionality without really realizing, okay, what's the problem we solve, right? They kind of lost sight of that. And they now start charging, but in the customer's eyes, he or she thinks, well, you've got all these functionalities, but I only need a few, so I'm not really willing to pay that much, right? So even just looking at competitors, that doesn't make sense anymore in a lot of cases. Then the number one thing we like to do when we sit down with customers is value-based pricing, which can sound daunting, especially if you just start out. But I think in the software space, in the majority of the cases, it makes sense. Sure, if your business is really about like cost reduction, well, even then you can relate to it, but you might look at different metrics. But basically what value-based pricing is, right? You figure out what's the value, like the business case we create for our customers, and we just take a percentage of that. And then you also, what you do as well, is you look at what's the certainty of us solving that problem. So let's say you're an insurance company, right? That insurance basically means in some cases, 1 out of 100 customers, right, actually need our help. So the value we create for that single customer, we can't really take, like, let's say 10% of that for everyone, because only 1 out of 100 need it, right? So you take the actual certainty of how likely you are to help with the business case and just a percentage of the value you create. And around that, what you can do is you can build pricing models that can discriminate between customers in a scalable manner. And I know that like this discriminating nowadays got a negative annotation, where in pricing is very positive if you can discriminate which your pricing model scalability.
Yeah. Instead of using the word discriminating, you can also say it's more tailored.
Exactly.
Like a
As a
tailored
salesperson,
pricing,
I never use it. In these calls, I'm happy to share it. Use the normal jargon we use. But yeah, definitely. You call that tailored, you call it custom pricing. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So like there are, how I see it, there are two levels to your service. So you actually have like the problem that you solve for the founders or the owners of the business, which, as I understand it, is basically, hey, like you're probably leaving some money on the table because the way that you are pricing your product is not optimal. So that's one. It's like a very clear-cut business case where you can add your own value-based pricing towards. And then the other thing, it's like the customer of your customer. So it's the way that the pricing actually makes sense for the problems that they solve for their customers. So to get like a better understanding of how you would like make like a deep dive into the problem of the customers of RevFixr, like how do your initial conversations go when somebody knocks on your door?
It's an interesting one. Of course, every flow differs, and we're in a current phase where we work with private equity, venture capital, and they already bring us in during the due diligence phase, where we scope, okay, what's the opportunity if we were to help those companies out with their pricing model, right? That sales trajectory is quite simple, right? They just fly you in. You have one session of half an hour to an hour, and it's basically, are we gonna do this, yes or no? And it is definitely not forced upon those software companies, but it's highly recommended. And sometimes if it's part of the due diligence as well, then you have to go through it if you want to get your investment. But let's take an example where we sit down with the actual SaaS company, right, with the founder. Usually by the time they sit down with us, they put it on the calendar for this year. So it's a top 3 priority. I think basically it's in the top 5 of almost any founder that they at some point should do it. But it's quite scary because, like I said earlier, right, if you charge too much, you're afraid you're going to lose deals. If you charge too little, you leave money on the table. Yeah. But I'd rather just not touch it so I don't have to think about it. That's the default state. And sometimes they get out of it and they say, okay, now it's time. We want to really lever our pricing. So we sit down with them. And initially we started going through a normal sales process because I have my background in B2B software, mostly with enterprises. So we started with that normal process I think every SaaS company goes through. However, we changed it where we have an intake conversation every time we start a client project. And we actually pull that up to become the first conversation in some cases. So we take an immediate deep dive into your business. And we talk about, first, of course, like what are your goals? Like, let's say you revisit pricing, right? What does that actually mean for your business? And also, like, what does success look like? We look at your business model because that's the context in which we'll work, right? We look at your pricing and packaging. What do you currently do? How do you get there? What does churn look like, etc. And the metrics. And most of those metrics we actually ask afterward. And then we look at the buyer experience. I think that's one that's often neglected. People think pricing and packaging is its own thing. But luckily I've had the experience myself of not only coming up with the price, but then also quoting it during a conversation. And if there's no rationale behind it, or you're just charging too much, that salesperson is not well seated to do that negotiation. So I know there's like 50% of your price is how you explain to your customer, and the other 50% is the price itself. I always like to say, if someone says something is too expensive, it's not because they don't have the money, but it's because, in their opinion, the value they get from it is too low for the price they pay. And if you can frame that value differently, right, then the willingness to pay actually goes up. So we do that intake with those 4 pillars, and then we'll basically give them a proposal within the next week where we say, okay, this is our services, but we add 1 or 2 slides saying, this is what we're going to do for the next 3 months for you guys. And quite often it's pricing and packaging, right? The first quarter, we usually like to sit down and redo the strategy. But after that, you can also think about monetization of your roadmap. I think I stated this before, but what we see over time is companies lose sight of the actual job to be done at the customer. They just keep on actually adding functionality to solve the same problem better. But there comes a point where there's no real leverage in doing that. And instead, you can look for an adjacent job to be done, right? That you can solve without pivoting too much, right? Where you can build out your product and now capture a different budget of your client. So sometimes we do include that as well, where we sit down with you and we figure out, okay, rather than keep playing with your pricing with the product you have, maybe we sit down and look, okay, what should you be building to unlocking other budgets inside your client's organization. But we usually start with this process. We quote it to them, and it's up to them whether or not they want to take on those projects.
I think that makes sense. Also, if you look, for example, at HubSpot, which started as like the marketing automation platform, and then they made the side step to the CRM.
Exactly.
And then also with customer success, they have like a content management system in there as well. So they started capturing basically everything that you can do.
Because the most expensive thing is, of course, the customer acquisition cost, right? So once you are actually in, I like to say as a rule of thumb, about 80% of the cost is in acquiring, 20% is in servicing them. right? It can definitely vary between companies. But once you're in, it's a mistake not to leverage that. Even if you now want to unlock completely new, different budgets, right? You want to go from the IT, and then maybe you can get SOC 2 or your ISO certification, and you can now figure out a way to upsell that, right? Or the you build out the SSO. There's different budgets elsewhere. Or in the HubSpot case, like now with getting sales involved, right, with the pipeline stuff, and then customer service. And I feel like HubSpot done a brilliant job at that, and I think all successful companies do a brilliant job at that. But it's a major differentiator between the companies that can go beyond 5 million and stick to 5 million.
And it's nice that you put a number out there, because like a couple of things that come to mind for me is like, hey, when are you going to say like, okay, we're gonna just first keep on focusing on the main problem that we
Yeah.
solve, the main jobs to be done. I'd like to go a little bit deeper into this afterwards as well. And when would you say like, hey, we are going to look for adjacent problems that are still in line with what we
Yeah.
do? So when you're selling marketing automation, it would not make sense to then add, I don't know, legal software to this, even though it might be this a problem your customers
Yeah.
experience. They're a bit out of your comfort zone, so to say. And you say like at about 5 million, it would make sense
I
to
mean,
start
yeah,
looking into.
it differs per organization, but one of the minimum requirements to do this is that there should always be one person available to do this discovery. And ideally, that's the founder, but it can also be a business developer if he has like some kind of entrepreneurial experience and tendencies. But the day to day of the business should be solid, and then if it's the founder, he shouldn't be worried about, hey, if he's not involved with the day to day sales, the next quarter the metrics are gonna look terrible. And I think once you get to 5 million or 3 million, at least in the Netherlands, 3 million is probably already fine and good enough. You get to a stage where you get time to explore different things. That's if you proactively want to go after it. At the same time, you can do it passively as well, right? And then it might become earlier. Let's say you have a product manager and that's constantly in conversations with your client organization to figure out, okay, how can we improve the product? At least you should be doing that. It might be that on a day, like he gets this random insight, this aha moment into, hey, wait, I think there's something there. Maybe now actually involve his coworker, right, who has the problem because he touched upon it. Um, and also start speaking with those people who aren't using it in the organization. But at least they know of the fact that the company is using your product. So you want to expand. Yeah, normally you'd only talk to users. If your product manager is also talking to people in the organization that aren't actively using it, I think you can also do it more passively. But otherwise, actively start doing it, let's say 5 million.
Okay, makes sense. So because I know from our previous conversations that you're a big fan of like the jobs to be done framework. Basically, this allows you to really pinpoint what your customers are trying to
Yeah,
achieve and how you can help them solve for this. And you've mentioned that also the buyer experience is very important, like the 50-50 value versus pricing. So they are connected, at least in how I look at this. So the jobs to be done framework, can you elaborate a little bit more on how you use
yeah,
this in your consulting?
definitely. So maybe a little bit of context, but there's not enough time, and I'm not smart enough to explain it to the level that Clayton Christensen can. But one of the things he says is people don't buy your product or services; they hire it to get a jobs done in their life. And once you figure that out, you'll also figure out immediately that your competitors are not just the people doing the exact same thing, but also completely different solutions to the same problem. And that's also where the core is of how we help our customers. Um, so, and I should add one more thing before we dive into it. Um, I lost my train of thought, but yeah. can cut it out. So, um,
now we're gonna leave this unedited. This is a raw podcast.
painful.
No, so you were talking about the jobs to be done framework that basically every customer, or at least every person or company, buys a
Yeah.
solution to make sure that a job gets
Yeah.
done. And this also means that your direct competitors
Exactly.
might not be your only
Yes.
competition, because also, how do you say that? Like, other solutions might be a competitor for solving the same job to be done.
Exactly. So
So that was
maybe,
basically
yeah,
what you were saying.
correct. So let's start at our own business model to explain exactly how we see that. We basically have 5 jobs to be done that we solve. So yes, we help with monetization, but there's very few applications where someone in our client organization say, hey, let's do monetization today. Hey, let's grow our revenue. You're constantly doing it, right? We have 5 jobs to be done. One of them is actually revenue growth, because sometimes people literally get the quarterly goal or the yearly goal, right? I grow the revenue. But in that case, and I think this is why I like the framework a lot, when that person gets that objective, we are 1 out of 1,000 things he can hire to do that job that quarter. You can play with your pricing, right? And unlock a lot more revenue. But you can also hire another sales agent if you're at that stage, right? To get more revenue. There's various things you can do. You can also work with partners. Maybe you figure out a way to merge with another company, right? That's all different ways of doing it. So without the job speed on framework, when someone asks me what are my competitors, I start looking at Simon Cooker, right? Like the big consultancies, right? That solve this problem. But when I look at the job speed done framework, I now actually look at it completely different. Like, what are all the things and the solutions he or she can hire? But also, what are the limitations versus that? And I will automatically also figure out, if I do this, at least in our case, what those critical events are for us, right? So like I already said, someone gets his quarterly goals. So, and it's usually the same 2 weeks where everyone come up with the yearly and the quarterly goals, right? So that's a great time to get into the air and say, hey, is pricing and packaging basically on your list this year as a lever to increase your revenue growth? And we also take our customers through this journey where we've actually built a value framework. We call it a value map, where we walk them to their own solution and figure out, okay, what jobs to be done do you actually solve? And then we keep on diving deeper and deeper. And once you understand that, you also figure out every jobs to be done has its own wallet owner. So in this case, I was talking about the jobs to be done of revenue growth. That might be with the chief commercial officer. But we have another one, which is increase your company valuation, either when you want to raise funds, right? Or you want to sell your company, right? For that job to be done, I go to a different wallet owner, which is usually the founder, right? Or the CEO. So depending on the job to be done, right? I go to a different person. And what you see happening with a lot of SaaS companies, there's usually one core jobs to be done. Let's take HubSpot as an example, right? So you first start with your actual customer relationship management, right? Like a database to manage all your customers. That's marketing, right? But at some point, marketing is using it well, and the sales says, hey, this is interesting for us as well. You have all this customer data. If we can track our deals and link it to those customers, right? Those individuals in the company, client company, that unlocks a lot of value for us as well. You're already inside that company, and now figure out you can start selling to sales, so you involve them. So you can maybe even double the price of your solution in this case, if you get both people in there. But if you were to say, like, the whole budget is for marketing, so they also pay for the job to be done of sales, that's going to be very hard, right? So we use this framework to see, okay, what problems are you actually solving for organization, but also like coupling it with the right stakeholders in your organization. And then we built a whole pricing model based on that. So going back again to the HubSpot example, marketing will be paying for the number of customers. I think in HubSpot they do like per 1,000 customers contacts, or at least that's how they used to. Now you have
Yeah.
marketing contacts, but it used to be per contact, right? But sales, they per seats, because the added value is for every salesperson you put in there. And it's not necessarily if you add the sixth marketeer in your team on HubSpot, that doesn't just add another 20% value, right? Just having that one seat does. So we really take the jobs to be done as a foundation of, okay, what should your pricing look like? Who pays for what, etc., and figure out, okay, what complexity can we add? Well, which one can't we, right? So in HubSpot's initial example of just doing marketing, just having one variable for your whole pricing that makes sense. And your ACV is also going to be maybe 1,000, maybe 2,000 per year. But once you start adding those other jobs you've done, you can get it up market, right? And you say, okay, we can now go to 10K, or you actually see HubSpot doing hundreds of thousands per customer at this point. So you can also add complexity to your pricing model, right? So this is all related, and I'm happy to share to anyone who is listening to this and who wants it. I'm happy to share our value map. But the first thing every company should do is map out which jobs are we solving, and that's the foundation for how you should be doing your pricing as well.
I think that is a very good takeaway. Especially when you're talking about like the different tiers of potential customers you're working with. So how I would normally also look at, for example, the win-loss analysis that we're doing. Like it all starts with like the customer segmentation, right?
Yeah.
So there are different types of customers and they all have their own specific needs. Like companies that are enterprise scale have different requirements than, for example, mid-market or SMEs. And then within each of these segments, you have basically the different types of people that you work with. So you have your users, you have like the economic buyer, perhaps even the champion, or the program owner, if you want to call it like this. So they all have their own jobs to be done.
I love that you say this, the segmentation, because that's exactly right. That's often a misconception. People look at demographics, right? The size of a company. But in some cases, where you do say, right, the bigger companies do have different jobs. But it's a misconception to think that the core jobs to be done changes necessarily, right? So in the big corporation, you still need to manage those contacts and that data, right? That is still the core job to be done. But if you can now unlock in that bigger company, like different jobs, because it's getting more complex, the customers are willing to pay for that. But the core might stay the same. And I think what we see often, and by the way, sorry to interrupt you, but and then taking a bit of a detour now, but if I look at most pricing pages as SaaS companies, what they do is like small, medium, big, right? But the jobs to be done isn't necessarily small, medium, big. It is more about the problems you solve become more and more complex, and you create more value elsewhere. So just doing small, medium, big, that doesn't make sense. We actually, not a single customer we help, we advise them to do this. We always try to really look at the jobs to be done. And often, in reality, of course, it is the bigger your company gets, the more complex the problem gets, and the more jobs to be done you can buy, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. It can be that the small company has all those problems and it is more to the core of their business. So they're willing to pay this enterprise fee essentially. Whereas the big corporate, right, might only hire you for the small one because it's not really the core of the business. So I think it's great that you mentioned segmentation, because I think this job to be done also starts teaching those companies and the people that use it, that segmentation shouldn't just be looking at the size of your customer, but actually figuring out which problems are we solving, and that we can solve the exact same problem on a helicopter view, right, as elsewhere, but the details might differ. So sometimes I'm in two radically different industries as solving the exact same problem. And the jobs to be done actually can explain that.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because that's actually how we look at segmentation also. So the easiest segmentation is like by industry, company size, stuff like that. But if you dive deeper into segmentation, you get more into like the use case
exactly.
segmentation,
Yes.
basically. And then that also becomes very interesting to take a look at, because you might see some trends that you would otherwise miss when you're only looking at geography or company
Only
size,
problem is it's more complex,
because of
right?
what you just
So,
said.
and you know this, right? People like it when it stays easy. So just looking at demographics, that's
Yeah.
nice. But this is, okay, if you want to do it right, you have to go more complex than that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, like I said, it's the easiest way
Yeah.
to do your segmentation. And like you need to make sure that your data warehouse is well set up if you want to also look more into like
Exactly.
the
Yes.
usage
Yes.
analytics and stuff like that, and base like certain things off of this. Um, yeah, and I'd like to go a little bit back to the how did you say it? Like there are multiple things that you can do to increase, for example, your revenue or like your
Yeah.
profit. And like if we take a quote from, I believe it was Alex Ramosi, like you can make more money in a couple of ways. Like either you sell the same thing more often to new people, or you sell it at a higher
Yeah.
price. And the same goes for your existing customers. You can sell it more often, like with higher frequency to your existing customers, or again, increase the prices. And from what I understand, the the focus that you guys have is really on, hey, how can we make sure that the pricing, so the contract value, is optimal. Um, but then being an entrepreneur myself, like I also get the jitters when I hear you talking about like, hey, you're probably able to increase your pricing a whole lot more if you frame it in the right way. So I would say like, hey, I could be scared that I'm going to lose potential customers, or maybe even that some of my existing customers might leave because the prices have increased by too much, or like the pricing, yeah, could be, how do you say that? Like is going to be
I get it. Yeah.
very
This
high
is this is
compared
a
to, for
very
example,
common
some
objection. Yeah.
competitors. Like, yeah, like how would you, well, convince or explain a founder or maybe somebody else that is responsible for the pricing of a certain product or feature or whatever? How would you have this conversation with them to make sure that they're understanding the
Yeah.
value of value-based pricing,
It's
basically?
very funny that you bring this up, because it is a very common objection why people, not necessarily in our conversation, because I think the majority already overcame that by sitting like before they sat with us. But just in general, that's the most common objection we see in the whole market. People are afraid of churn. Hey, um, the funny thing though is somehow it got into people's minds that 0% churn is a positive thing. There's this 9 points or 0.9, I think it's 9 point, the VC. They had built a framework. It's about a couple animals, the mice, the rabbits, deers, elephants, and whales, and it's about ACV size. So the mice are $100. Think about Dropbox, Spotify. Then you got the rabbits. That's the initial HubSpot when they just did the CRM. But then over time they became the elephants, which is 100K. You have the deers in the middle, 10K, and the whales, which are $1 million each, right, in ACV. And basically, depending on which you focus on, that tells also a lot about what healthy metrics look like. But let's take the deers, for example. So you focus on customers on average doing 10K a year, right? And we're talking about, by the way, software as a service here, right? So you assume those people come
Yeah,
back next
yeah,
year.
yeah. We're
That's definitely important to mention here, because otherwise this model won't make sense anymore. But a healthy churn rate there, and this has been benchmarked by looking at more than 100 of the most successful software companies in the world, right? Salesforce, HubSpot, you name it. It's about 15% churn per year on all and we're looking at customers. Sorry, at revenue here. And a lot of people we talk to, they don't even come near that 15%. If I tell them like you should lose 15% of the customer, they look at me like I'm crazy. right? So that means if you are near zero, that actually means that your price is probably too low. And if no one goes away, it means it will take you 100+ years to actually extract all the value you're supposed to extract, right? But you can speed it up a little. So with 15%, what we talk about, like 6-7 years to basically get everything out of the customer base you have today. So what we tell people when we sit down and they ask about it, like churn and what happens if I increase my price, what we say is, if your churn isn't at 15% for the years, right? And of course, we change this depending on who we're talking to, then that's a good thing, right? You rather want to get rid of some of the legacy customers, but get more from the entire customer base, than stay with the headache customers. So let me give a very easy example. Let's say you make 1 million a year, right? And we double the price, but that causes 20% churn. So instead of 1 million, now make 800, but from the 800K, right? That's going to double. That's 1.6 million. So you now make 60% more with 20% fewer customers to service, right? Which to me sounds like an ideal world. And what a lot of people don't really realize is, the first customers, and not all of them, but the first customers to churn are usually the smaller ones who can't afford it. Sure, there are exceptions, and sometimes the bigger one will go away. But what we see when we help our customers optimize the price, it's the legacy customers that they initially started with, right? The people that got them there. And there's emotional attachment to those customers, right? Which we respect. And I can come back to that in a bit. But the majority of those you want to lose, because you want to look at the customers that bring in the most revenue and figure out from those people, how can we unlock more revenue by looking at the jobs to be done, for example? If we look at the normal distribution of customers at our clients in SaaS, it is quite often that 50% of the total revenue is made up of more than 80% of the customers that are all very small. And the other 50% of the revenue is from the 20% biggest customers. The problem then, if you realize that, is that once you start talking to customers, the smaller ones are overrepresented in the data the product manager is going to get, because it's 80% of your customer base. So if he talks to 10 people, probably 8 of those are the smaller ones and 2 are the bigger ones, right? You kind of want to drop those ones at the end of the long tail and really focus on the bigger ones, because they will tell you where the next pot of gold is. And the smaller ones won't tell you that. So we try to drive this point home that there is such a thing as healthy churn, and that there's also such a thing as churn that's too low. Of course, if it's higher than the benchmark, right, then upping the price might not make sense, and we do the whole reverse thing, right? Maybe we actually figure out that the churn should go down, and that your price should go down. This hasn't really happened recently with any of our customers, but there's something we would also do if we do see that. Then going back to the emotional, this is the last thing I will say on this, is if you do a whole new pricing model and you do have those legacy ones where you're 100% they're going to churn if you increase the price. You are a software as a service company. Getting that extra license out to them, right? As long as there's no consultancy involved, your marginal cost of serving those people, especially if they've been with you for 10 years, is probably near zero. What we advise to do, if you are afraid of losing those, or there's some kind of relationship, right? Even though we are in business, but we respect those as well, because we often work with the founders, right? We just say, give them the new pricing model, just give them a hefty discount, maybe even in perpetuity, right? That's fine, but do bring them on the new pricing model. So even if you increase only the price, give them the new price, but give them it discounted. And explain to them this is only because of the relationship. Again, we're not proactively advising you to do this, but sometimes we meet with founders that have this loyalty towards certain people, which again, I respect, because they got them to this point, right? But then still migrate everyone to the new pricing model and use discounts to keep some of those if the marginal cost is lower than what they bring in.
There's a lot of topics for conversation about how to do this. So there's a lot of things that come out of this.
For sure.
Solving one problem often exposes the next one. And to be honest, like if your churn is very high, it is probably not to do with your pricing. It has to
Very
do
true.
with
Very
something
true.
else. It has probably more to do with the value, like the time to value, the amount of
100%
value,
agree.
expectations being met or not. So there's a lot more that goes into churn than just the pricing.
100% agree.
At least
Yes.
from the research that we have done. So we've been talking for quite some time now already, and we have to like close this off a little bit, even though I think it's a very interesting topic where I think we can fill like a good entire
I mean,
day.
if you ask me, I
of
can fill a
just
whole week about
talk.
pricing, but
Yeah, easily. So like when we're going to take a look a little bit more into the future, what would you say are going to be like the biggest shifts that you are seeing already in like the B2B SaaS market when it comes to pricing and packaging?
one of the things I've been reading a lot about, but I disagree with most of it, is this whole thing that we're moving away from seat based, and that everyone is looking towards usage based. There is truth to that, but I think that's a misinterpretation of the data. People are not moving away from seat based, but let's say all the AI companies are more likely to look at usage based, like at prompts, at those things, right? AWS is a great example of a good usage based model. But over the years, what you saw is like a lot of value we can now start creating, not based on like an individual license of someone who can log in, but with AI, you will see that in a lot of cases, that person doesn't even need to log in. So a lot of the new companies started adopting those, which is good. But the idea that we're moving away from a seat based, that is BS, in my opinion. So the real movement we've been seeing is that new technology unlocks new pricing models. And a lot of people always ask us, okay, like where do we even start? And to me, it's quite an easy one to answer. Okay, where should you start? Especially if you do value based, it's very simple. If I want to create more value for my customer, what is the number one variable that does that? So, like again, going back to HubSpot, if we're looking at the sales, the sales part of it, right, the pipeline, etc., then I'm adding more value for every seat I add because that person is now capable of accessing all the data, logging his own tasks, etc. Right? So I'm dramatically increasing the value we gain as a company every time I do that, right? So therefore, seat based makes sense. Right. So if you, and then going to AWS, maybe to add another example, it's about your server bill, right? Adding a seat there doesn't make any sense, but the more data I can store, that does, right? So the most important like variable that makes up the added value to your customers, that should be the first variable of your whole pricing model, the core that basically never changes. And then you can start adding up to those. So while I do see like new pricing models coming out in the market, I think that the question of how to get there, right, should always be the same. Like, how do you create value and how do we really capture that? And then you can imagine quite simply, right, like if I had more like new technologies and I figure out none of the existing pricing models make sense, then maybe I create a new one. So that's my nuance on a change that has been shouted. Like if I look at LinkedIn almost every day, as I've been seeing this for the last 3 months. So that's a nuance I like to add. That's the first one. Another one that we are trying to create essentially a movement is where companies start pointing someone out internally that will be responsible for pricing and packaging. So what we usually see when we get into somewhere, right, and we deal with mostly with founders, but then once we work with the bigger ones, there's also the sales, the marketing, etc., the products involved. And we ask, okay, who is actually responsible for it? And then they say, we are. No, but who? That we, right? So I think fixing your pricing and packaging should start with pointing one person out and putting it on the calendar every single quarter. Just like you put it, like your marketing targets, your sales targets, your financial targets, product on the quarterly review with management, there should be one item that says pricing packaging, and there should be a name behind it. And it can be the founder, it can be the product owner, it can be the salesperson in your organization, it can be anyone. But I think you don't necessarily need to hire as the first step, as long as you already take this step, which is a very simple one. Just putting it on the calendar and making someone accountable for it. And I think even if we don't do any more business, right, as a company, RevFixr, we'd already be happy if this is a movement we can create, where pricing and packaging becomes like someone becomes the owner of that internally. So that's a movement we're trying to create.
That's nice, man. Well, you got my support. No.
Thank you.
So to basically get your point across, like value-based pricing should be the way to go
For most companies.
looking
yes.
forward. And yeah, for most companies, and that doesn't mean that it has to be usage or seat-based. It would really depend on the jobs that you're solving for your customers.
Exactly.
So make sure that you have a good understanding of this. And we're going to add the link to the value map in the notes so that people can start playing around with this. And if they need any help, like we're also going to make sure that they're able to find you. I always like to end the interviews with just a small trip down memory lane. So when you first started out, you are able to now, let's say we're traveling back in time and you're able to talk to your younger self, to the young TJ. Like what advice would you give to younger TJ? Like what is one thing that TJ should keep doing, and what is one thing that TJ should ditch immediately?
Food is a very good one. At the same time, I mean, I know it's cliche, but initially my response would be I wouldn't tell him anything, right? Because I like where I am today, and I don't think without the mistakes I would have gotten here. But maybe I can figure out a way to get there faster.
That's very politically correct. But no, you have to tell yourself one thing that you should keep doing and one thing you should stop.
I've always been stubborn, right? And every, like you become a founder, right? Once you figure out, okay, the system isn't made for stubborn people, essentially, right? With anything. And I mean, I was always stubborn. I always thought like the majority of the time it was fine. But if I could tell myself anything, it's like, stay stubborn. Honestly, just stay stubborn, right? Ignore most of the things they tell you, and keep finding out what you like to do, right? If I would have changed anything in my life, I'd love it if I could have found out what I love to do just one day earlier, or like a year earlier, right? So I could spend more time on that. But because I was stubborn and a bit entrepreneurial, right? Often I couldn't really, I lost a lot of my curiosity because I said, well, don't be doing it, right? So I definitely could tell myself to be more stubborn. In terms of stop doing, that's also a good one. Maybe tell myself, and this might also be a cliche, but you're still an idiot, right? Because being stubborn is one thing. That means like you go figure out your own path, right? Figure out what the truth is. But I also know, like back in the day, sometimes I thought I was a smart ass, right? I thought I knew things, but then you get older and you're like, oh, every single human being has this. Looking back, like you're an idiot. But I tell myself, that's the first thing I tell myself: you're an idiot. You're not as smart as you think, right? Especially back then. You're gonna learn a lot, but be curious and figure out, okay, what are you, like, where are you wrong? Right? But you're an idiot.
Yes, that's very good. I that is
It's relatable.
something that is very, yeah, not just relatable. Like the word idiot is one I use more often than not. Like almost
Yeah.
every day it comes out of my mouth. No, so I think that's a very good one. So what is next for RevFixr? What's coming up? You have any like fun stuff you're doing in the near
I mean,
future?
we're very early stage. I mean, my co-founder Anwar has been working in pricing for the last 10 years, where he helped all the Procter & Gamble, Coca-Cola, right, big consumer brands. And I have 10 years of experience now in the software industry in pricing. But as a company, we together and we started hiring people as well now. Um, it's all very early stage. So that also means there's a lot of stuff we still want to validate. And one of the most exciting things we're doing right now, um, we already helped several companies successfully as well. But we are trying to figure out how can we really make it an ongoing thing, where pricing and packaging doesn't become something you look at every 5 years, and we can help our clients for the next 12 months or 24 months, right? And really almost become a subscription. We call it monetization as a service. And we actually already have a few customers, right, where we're doing this with. But the next, let's say 6 months, is us really figuring out this model and what that should look like. And undoubtedly, we're going to make a lot of mistakes. But it's the thing we are most
That's good.
excited about. Is really figuring out how can we build a pricing organization within someone else's organization. And just the whole idea that the number of mistakes I'm going to make, that actually excites me, right? There's going to be a lot of aha moments. I've had a lot of those in just the last 6 months, way more than at any other company I worked with. So that's driving me every single day, and knowing I'm going to try and solve something difficult.
Awesome. Well, we're going to make sure that people are able to find you. We're going to put all the information, the links to
Thank you. Yeah.
LinkedIn, to your website, to RevFixr, link to the value map so that people can start taking a look at that. And if they need any help with like trying to get more out of their like current offer by just making like smart decisions when it comes to pricing and packaging, they should definitely contact you. So thank you so much, Tjitte or TJ, for spending the time with me today.
Thanks for having me.
I hope you enjoyed the interview. And well, this is it for now. And stay tuned for the next episode. Bye.
Bye.